All right, I received a well thought out email, and I knew as I was reading it that other people would have the same kinds of thoughts. And I thought maybe it would be useful to reply to this in a video so that everyone else could benefit from it. And I asked if the writer of this would give me permission for that. And he said yes. And I'm just scrolling down to make sure I took his name out. I did. Good. Okay, some time ago, I believe I received a commandment from God. I say believe because I did not meet him, but I received specific words in my heart and mind. In the same fashion I usually receive messages I recognize as God's voice. Anywho, I like the Midwestern flair there. He's not from the Midwest. Um, this is good. We are supposed to learn the pattern of how God speaks to us, and it can cut down the time and effort it requires to recognize his voice. He says the commandment was that I was to stay and teach in church until I was actively forced out. I wish I had the quote with me written down, but that was the message, and it feels proper relaying it that way. And I respect the fact that he did write it down. That's always good. It's not wise to rely on your memory. I had an employee once among the dozens who had an impeccable ability to remember things. And everyone else, I asked them to bring a notepad and a pen anytime we had a conversation. But he didn't have to do that. He was the only one. And so it's really rare to be able to retain things the way we need to. And if it's that important at work, it's much more important. If God tells you something, that should be treated as the most important thing until proven otherwise. If he's going to interrupt like that, then it's probably pretty important. And the more you treat it as important, the more he will speak to you. Okay. And then the writer here expresses that he's really cautious in stretching what is told to him beyond his sincere belief of the limits. That's also really important. Whenever we get communication from God, or even just situations we might be in, blessings, it's easy to fly too close to the sun and have your wings melt. And it's really important to operate within the bounds of the instructions that we're given. I'll give you a recent example. So whenever the Lord gives me dreams, I write them down if I'm aware of them. And I'll force myself to get up and write them down. If I'm asleep, or if I wake up and I realize I had one, I'll immediately go to my computer and write it out. And the reason I do that is because years and years ago, I didn't do that, and I lost absolutely precious things that I don't remember anymore. And so I made this a habit, and as a result of that, I started having more dreams. But I retain these, and I look over them from time to time. And one thing that I had to teach myself not to do was to fly too close to the sun, to take these dreams for more than what I had very good reason to believe they were. And you can interpret not just dreams, but any kind of information. You can stretch it as far as you like, but you should limit it to what you have sufficient reason to believe. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with leaving things open-ended where you don't have the information to take it further than that. And so I just yesterday, I spent some time reviewing a pair of dreams from 3 years ago. And, that's good. So anyway, that was long-winded, but it's good to be careful with these things, as this person obviously is. He continues, when I received that call, it seemed contrary to what I believed God was calling me to. I think there's something missing here. Oh, no. Okay. So he was saying it was a surprise that God was telling him to stay. As time has gone on, that commandment has been the only reason I continue going to church classes. It is increasingly unbearable to stay in those classes. For hours, I continue thinking of every way I could possibly improve their vision on God's plan and will for their own lives. And it's like trying to get water through solid stone. For all it is worth, it has given me a great education on what others in the scriptures have experienced when trying to preach to their fellow man. Yes, and I would interject how God feels when he's trying to preach to us individually. I feel physically exhausted from the mental work that I am pushing myself at to help in some way. Despite my efforts, I always feel that I could share more, but there is no one to share it to. Well, this is a great example of how we are more excited to serve God in some ways than others. And part of the changes that we require to become more like him is to come to enjoy whatever he assigns us to do as much as we would whatever else he might assign us to do. And that's very difficult. It's easy to say, it's very hard to do, but practice makes perfect, right? I'm reminded of the difference between Alma and Limhi when each was responsible for leading a group of people. And Alma's group immediately, when they were each at different times and places, they were each imprisoned, taken into captivity, I should say, by the Lamanites. And Alma's group responded by submitting to the experience as God's will and praying to him, but totally submitting. And Limhi's people decided to try to fight it, and they kept going to battle with the Lamanites and getting slaughtered. And Alma's group ended up being visited very quickly by the Lord, and he said, well, you've learned the lesson here. Let's move on. This doesn't have anything left to teach you. And Limhi's people, it was, oh, you need some remedial training. We'll leave you in this extra long just to make sure that you get the lesson. Right? So life has a purpose, and as you accomplish that purpose, you move on to the next lesson. And you can't cheat this. You can't bear with, I'll say affliction, but whatever unpleasantness in life only to get out of it. That's not learning the lesson. And this is actually a deep point. You have to get, it's a cheat code for life that I'm giving you. You have to get to the point where you stop seeking relief. This is the fullness of Mosiah 3:19, is to see struggles in life as the love of God, to truly see it as the whatever you're facing as the greatest gift he could possibly give you, because he knows what's on the other side of it. Which the most important part of that is how you grow as a person because of it. So the only shortcut to that is to go through it. To fully extract everything that you could in terms of how it can help you improve. And to my friend here, I'd say that as you receive the heart of the Lord, you'll have to be torn away from this. That's how much your attitude will change toward it. That you'll beg him for a way to stay and help. And he'll have to take it from you. Continuing in the email, I thought a lot on how boldly, I'll pause here. Now, some of you have the opposite, I'd say many of you have the opposite problem. That he's telling you you're needed elsewhere, or that the cost of you staying in your church is higher than the benefit. And to you, that's the tearing away. That you're going to require him to be more blunt and forceful in how he's showing you that you need to go. He continues, I've thought a lot on how boldly I should speak, and I try to ride as fine a line as I can between pushing them to create the most amount of improvement towards God and not going too far so that they don't hear me at all. Yep, that's the game. I've been more successful with the young men who I know have received many of my words when they are not with their teachers. I know this. Yeah, I'll pause here. And maybe that's the whole benefit, is just to maintain the credibility that you have with these people that you wouldn't if you stopped going. And maybe that's only useful outside of class. Now, this isn't about being dishonest, because this person's obviously speaking up in class, and we'll get to more of that, I believe, later. Let's see. I know this because they frequently will ask me questions about how they can apply what I've taught them in their own lives once I've handed them the keys I've been given. And just so no one freaks out about this, if you're still with us, but you haven't watched many of these videos, that use of keys is, I think, more like how I would use it and not how certain churches might use it. So don't freak out there. He's not saying he has quote unquote priesthood keys. He's talking about keys, pieces of information is what he's talking about. I glory in my God to do this work. However, what I can teach is mainly faith and repentance on a very practical scale. This is fine, and I love doing it because I see God's love for them when their eyes glow and they are free to exercise God's will more freely in their life. Okay, so here I'll poke a little at this. Again, that the next level of this is doing it even when they hate you for it. Now, I'm not saying to push them past what they have any hope of believing. I'm not saying like dump greater light and truth on them against their will and force truth on them and push them way past their window of receipt. I'm saying God can send many people to teach what will be received well. He can send very few people to teach what will absolutely be rejected. And his plan requires that everyone receive everything they're willing to receive. And that requires that they're filled to the point where they say, no more. I don't want any more. Every single person ever born has to have that opportunity. And when we think of the field being white already to harvest and the work is great, but there are few laborers, harvesting isn't just collecting up the wheat. It's also threshing the wheat, so beating it, and separating the wheat and the chaff, which is called winnowing. Threshing and winnowing are required before the wheat can go into the garners, and it's just as important. And it's harder to find people to sign up for that job. It's like the night shift. He continues, I'm limited by how highly they value their false traditions and teachers. In the church and seminary classes I go to, I'm very limited by the subject matter the teacher has chosen. Since I was a little kid, I always knew I could teach better and greater ideas than the teachers that were over me, and it always bothered me, but not so much as it does now, when I see that what they teach is not just too simplified and therefore unhelpful in a complex context, but also blatantly false in a way that binds God's children to sin and despair. Going to their classes feels like being force-fed someone else's vomit, but I know that there is a better way. So I'll interject here, and those of you watching this might say, man, this guy's really arrogant. He feels like he could do a better job than all the teachers he's ever had. Maybe if a person was arrogant, they would say this. First off, I'd say if they can say it this way, they're probably not being arrogant. If they have this level of articulacy, probably that what they're saying is true. Okay? They're demonstrating that it's probably true. But beyond that, those of you who have been in experiences like this can understand better than others how this feels, and that the last thing on this person's mind and heart is quote unquote being in charge. Actually, what he would like more than anything else is to go there and be blown away by greater light and truth than he's ever received in his whole life. Even if it made him feel terrible about himself because it just showed all these ways he could be better. He would be so happy to be there. He'd pick that door if it was an option. We'll talk more about this in a minute, I think. Let me scroll down, otherwise we'll just do it now. We'll do it now. So, in the scriptures, we read about this feeling. There are two things here. One is this urge to say something bigger, better, greater. And then the other is this feeling that you're being force-fed someone else's vomit. So on the one hand, it's a sense of the greatness of God, and the other, it's a sense of the limitations of man. That's probably a very polite way of putting it. I'll read this one first. In 2 Nephi 1:27, Lehi reacts to how angry Laman and Lemuel are at Nephi's preaching. He says, "It must needs be that the power of God must be with him, even unto his commanding you that ye must obey. But behold, it was not he, but it was the Spirit of the Lord which was in him, which opened his mouth to utterance, that he could not shut it." And so the natural reaction to being invited to improve is to be angry and to see this as someone's trying to boss me around, right? Even unto his commanding you that ye must obey. But it's just the wicked that take the truth to be hard. The righteous rejoice in invitations to improve. They rejoice even if they don't agree with it, because they're thinking, wow, someone cared enough to try to help me. That's cool. But if they agree with it, all the more reason to rejoice, because they think, wow, someone's just given me a huge gift of how I can be better, and I understand that all good things are coupled to being good. And so they're helping me get even better things in my life. But Lehi explains, because he knows from firsthand experience, he's preached to people before, that you can be influenced by the Spirit of God to such an extent that you can't shut your mouth. So now I'm going to hop over to Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 9. And Jeremiah knew a thing or two about preaching to wicked people. But here's the verse. "Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in mine heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones. And I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay." So what's the context of this? Jeremiah was continually resisted in his preaching. And in the prior verse, he was talking about how he says, "The Lord was made a reproach unto me, and a derision daily." The people treated him terribly as a result of his preaching. And so he decided that he wasn't going to do it anymore. That's what it says. "Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in mine heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay." And this fire in the bones is what this person is talking about. And I get it. So, at this point, I'm going to talk about how we can be conduits of the Spirit, and we use our bodies as a bridge. And this is our role in the atonement of Christ. So let me just briefly explain that. So we are created in the image of God, and that makes us potentially temples for his Spirit. And so as we become worthy of that, of greater, so the light of Christ is given to every man. It comes from being born. And you can live your life in a way that diminishes the potency of that, but you can also live your life in a way that increases it. And you can go beyond the measure given to every man. You do that by exercising heed and diligence, by being obedient in living up to how you sincerely believe God to be, and in searching out more about how he is and living up to that too. So as you do this, you open the aperture of the Spirit of God. John the Baptist said of Jesus, this is in John chapter 3, what's his specific words that he uses? I'm trying to remember here. In essence, what he says is, he says the Father gives the Spirit to the Son without measure. In other words, Jesus had removed every impediment in that flow. And that's what we're called to do too. We're invited to do the same. And so as you open this aperture wider and wider, his Spirit fills you more fully. Okay, that's what happens internally. What happens externally? Well, the effect of that Spirit through you impacts everyone in contact with you. Now, it can do that in physical ways. When Moses came down from the mountain, his face was glowing. When Peter walked by people, if they were sick, they'd be healed. When Elisha's bone touched a dead man, he was healed. Imagine being so full of the Spirit of God that after you die, your bone heals a dead guy. So that is the physical portion of that. There's an informational portion of that. What you say or what you do and how you say it or how you do it impacts people. And it becomes a bridge through which they can see more of the Father. Now you might say, well, why is that even necessary? We can all just seek him out ourselves. We all have access to the Spirit as well. Yeah, kinda. Now you hear the record needle rip across the record, right? You're like, wait, what? Hold up. Wait a minute. When you offend the Spirit of God, you turn the direction of your path. You come off the straight and narrow. How do you get back onto it? The Spirit can be offended. And you can think of it, the question is, how do you recover it? How do you turn your path back to growing and opening that aperture instead of closing it tighter and tighter? As it closes, it's not just the bandwidth that reduces. What do I mean by that? If you think of a pipe and you make the pipe more narrow, that's bandwidth reduction. Less liquid can flow through it. But in this case, you also constrain what he can tell you and how he can tell it to you. Not just how much he can tell you, but what he can tell you and how he can tell you. Now, is a person limited in those same ways? God said, the Spirit does not always strive with man. There are things we can do to constrain that relationship. The things that a person can get away with are greater than the things that the Spirit can get away with. The things a person with the Spirit of God can do are greater for a person and to a person, are greater than what the Spirit of God can do directly to a person. And you might think that sounds rather blasphemous. Let me explain how and why, and then hopefully it doesn't seem blasphemous at all. God has perfect intelligence. We are doofuses. The Spirit of God requires sincerity. Sincerity is the gateway to the Spirit of God. Being a doofus, you can be sincere, and through that sincerity, you can be sincere in ministering to someone in situations where the Spirit of God will not directly do that. And so in your doofushood, you can become a conduit to bless people in ways that they would not otherwise be blessed. There's a huge mystery, but I'm explaining it to you, and now you know. So we could spend hours expounding this from the scriptures, but we're just in the midst of an email, so I'll just lay it out like that, and you can take it as far as you'd like on your own, or come back at another time and we'll talk more about it. So this person who wrote me the email, they are using their body as a bridge between heaven and earth to bring God's Spirit to people in greater quantities than they qualify for. And this is how we all participate in the atonement of Christ. Atonement means to reconnect a person with God. That connection is severed, it's constrained, and atonement is to reestablish it and to expand it. You've probably never thought about it that way, but that's what it is. So, now we get to understanding why it feels like being force-fed someone else's vomit. Now, you feel like that because the things that that person or those people are doing or not doing or saying and not saying are offensive to the degree of the Spirit that is within you. It's not offensive to them because their aperture is too narrow. They don't see those things. They don't feel those things. But you do. And this is the price you pay. This is what it costs for you to become a bridge between heaven and earth for them. Your body bears the cost of transmitting God's Spirit to them. And the greater that difference, the greater the suffering. And now you can start to just barely understand the price Jesus paid every day of his life to be here and to be constantly surrounded by people whose every act offended the Spirit within him because it was less than it could have been and should have been. Continuing in this email, well, one thing I'm going to say, let me back up on the topic of doofuses conveying the Spirit of God. Heaven is organized as a hierarchy, and the higher up you go, the more similar those people are to God. There are 4 special angels who surround the throne of God. And one of the things they do is they constantly cry out mercy. In fact, the Ark of the Covenant had 2 angels on it, and it's called the mercy seat. Those angels used their wings to veil the presence of God, like curtains. So my question for you is, who are they crying mercy to? And what direction did the veil function in? God sees everything. So the wings were to cover the presence of God. And so that from us, to help us, to protect us. Because the glory of God is so great that you have better chances looking at or being in the presence of the glory of an angel than the glory of God in his fullness. And so it steps it down so that it's closer to what you can receive and interact with directly. And I hope you see the connections with what we're talking about here. Because in a real way, this guy sitting in the Sunday school class is doing the same thing. But back to crying mercy. You might be tempted if the veil's for the people, Who are they crying mercy to? Not the people. They're crying mercy to God. And you say, wait a second. How could angels be more merciful than God? They're not. They're just not as intelligent. And those 4 angels are really, really high in the hierarchy. They're right close to the top. So how is it that they are also, in a way, and I mean this in the most respectful way possible, how is it that they are also doofuses? Well, they're still less intelligent than God. Well, why is that a blessing? Why did God set that up? It seems contrary to his purpose if they're crying mercy when he wouldn't. How does that function? Why does it work? There's a law in heaven that, and forgive my phrasing here, I'm just trying to convey a fact the best way I can. There's a law in heaven that says no man can be more merciful than God. It can't happen. And it's so important, and that law in and of itself is great evidence of God's great mercy. Because the reason for it is so that we never have any reason to doubt his love. Because that helps us to do and be better than we otherwise would. And so it's for our sake that he does this. But to fulfill this law, if someone sincerely invokes mercy for another person, and they are willing to pay the price to give it, then God has to accommodate it. And this is a very beautiful thing. And it's by this that all of creation is united in love and held together in Christ. It's very deep. It's very important. But there comes a time when even those angels can no longer cry mercy. These, by the way, are the angels at the 4 corners of the earth. It's the same 4. And you read about these angels in the book of Revelation when there's a time described that they revoke their willingness to cry mercy to the world because their wickedness, the world's wickedness, exceeds their ability to have faith in crying mercy. If you want an easier to understand example of this principle, you can read in the Book of Mormon. When Mormon, who was a general over the Nephite armies, got to the point where he could no longer pray, he says, and ask for God's mercy on his troops, he says he couldn't pray in faith for that because he knew they were so wicked in spite of so much that he had done to try to teach them and persuade them to be better, and because in spite of so much that the Lord had done in preserving their lives against harrowing odds, that he could no longer pray for them in faith. Remember what I said about sincerity? You'll see that that's relevant to this email. Many of the teachers, I'm reading again, many of the teachers I try to teach privately in other conversations. They are often wowed by my knowledge, but fail to take on my calls to improve. Sounds like the religious leaders in the temple when Jesus was a kid. And again, you might think that this guy's arrogant by reading his email and not knowing anything else about him. If you had greater understanding, you wouldn't, because this email is saturated with evidences of the light that he has. But you would also condemn the Lord if you knew him as a kid and you saw him teaching these religious leaders in the temple and asking them questions that they couldn't answer and answering their questions that they didn't know the answers to. Because boy, Jesus would say this also. They were wowed by my knowledge, but they failed to take on my calls to improve. continuing here, I care about them, and I've tried my hardest to show them light they would never have otherwise considered. One of them I've convinced to read your book, Joy on Purpose, and I'm going to be talking with him about how it's going. I pray that he will adapt with those teachings because I know his family will be forever blessed if he does. Besides him, I've learned that even more open-minded teachers... Sorry, I missed the opportunity for a joke. See, I told you he was full of light. He's recommending Joy on Purpose. Just kidding. Besides him, I've learned that even more open-minded teachers will readily accept some Baptist preacher who proclaims that Satan isn't real, but will automatically reject you for your background. Yep. Since that experience, I've tried not to point them to your videos explicitly and simply teach them myself as much as I can and drop hints to your books when I can. I think that that's a wise approach. In any case, I know that these teachers are intelligent and some of them are seeking more light and truth, but I have to balance the desire to teach them and their students who are being cudgeled into false traditions. It sounds painful. Just backing up a tick here. So when it comes to sharing information that you've received, you need to separate the information from the source. And what I mean by that, there will be people who can benefit from the ideas who don't have the faith to receive the source. And when I say the source, I'm being intentionally ambiguous. That could mean a person who is attached with a whole bunch of descriptions or connections or life experiences that will be too hard for most people to deal with. But it also could be, just think of like a math book that's particularly poorly written, and maybe you're some kind of math genius and you can still learn math from it. You could probably teach it a lot better, especially if you have to break down specific things. Like maybe you don't need to know how to measure the volume of any 3D shape. Maybe what a person needs to know is how to measure the volume of an aluminum can. And they don't need to know differential equations to do that. But maybe you do know differential equations, and so you can reach into that and query your understanding and pull out the tightest little package that makes measuring the volume of a can possible. Right? So if all you can do is hand them a book, then, and with Joy on Purpose, that there are a million things in there that could be pulled out as one-offs, but there certainly is a case to be made that the greatest value of that is the system itself, which necessarily cannot be broken down, right? But, you know, if the best you can do is hand them, The Glory of God is Intelligence, that book I wrote, it's a really thick book and it's densely written. And odds are, if they haven't picked that up and read it themselves already, they're probably not going to. Or if they did, they probably wouldn't get much out of it. But maybe you can read one section of that and find somebody that could use that information. And maybe you just paste that section and send it to them. But more likely, you could have a conversation with them and reduce it down to one sentence, just said in the context of everything else. It's just some idea that maybe you don't even remember where you read it. It doesn't matter, right? It becomes part of your model for how to see the potential in all things, which is one way of thinking about your model of God. And that's way more valuable than handing someone a book. Even Jeff Bezos can do that. Okay. Many times I've reflected on your teachings on hierarchical truth and your teachings on giving as much light as you can to those who will accept it the most, with the goal for the greatest amount of overall benefit. Your videos on teaching offensive things are the most important to me. See? Told you. And I've studied them vigorously to be able to apply them to how I work. There are countless examples in the scriptures of how to teach. What I've learned as a general rule is that you teach whatever God commands you to teach, and that God commands you to teach through many ways, and chiefly through your conscience. And I think that's him saying what I just said, is you think about the potential of all things, and then you try to formulate the next step towards that. And then you act on that. Another general rule I've learned is that when you teach, you should optimize the greatest amount of benefit to all people that can be received by your teaching. Yes, and to put that into another way of saying it, what he's saying is you can't teach all people all things. So prioritize the greatest benefit to all people. So in some cases, that might mean you offend everybody except for one person, but then that person is going to cure cancer, right? That sort of thing, that can be part of the math in all of this. It's not just a numeric number of people, it's the overall benefit to all on the longest time frame. And that can sound really complicated, but it's really not. It can be as simple as you want it to be. Oh, and that's what he said in the next sentence. I should have just read the next sentence. That does not mean that all people will be benefited from your saying, but that the net effect will be beneficial. So what's a scriptural example of that, guys? Can you think of one? Now I'm doing the Blues Clues. Anybody? What about Alma? Alma Sr., right? So Abinadi came and he preached, and he was killed for that preaching. And who listened? Alma. You could think, well, geez, all that for one guy. Yeah, but what did that one guy do? And what was the multi-generational effect of that one guy? And by translation, that was the effect of Abinadi. He did exactly what he should have done. Now, how much of that he knew, I don't know, but he did what he was told to do. And whatever the mix between go and do this thing kind of commandment and actively thinking about the benefit it would have over time, it's not as important. But that's the kind of calculation. Okay, continuing. However, what I've also learned is that some things must be said to retain a state of sincerity. Now we're tying into what I said about that, right? I've not reached a point where I can clearly identify what I must say to retain that state of sincerity. When I am sitting in many of these lessons or conversations, I'm perpetually hammered by what the Spirit is telling me at seemingly high volume. And now I hope what I said before plugs into this, right? Your body is the interface between a higher level of the Spirit of God and a lower level. Higher level in you, lower level in them. And just because you're being perpetually hammered by what the Spirit is telling you, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It will absolutely be the case when you're doing something right. But it also doesn't mean that you're doing something right. But it will be there if that's true. And it will be more intense the more light you have. This is part of a huge pile of suffering that comes with higher awareness. Continuing now, it is a very bitter thing to hold all of that back, as you know very well. I want to say so much, but I know that if I say everything that is on my mind, I will cause more harm than good. Yes. And this is why another thing in that pile of high awareness is loneliness. You see, loneliness goes away when we reveal ourselves at a deep level to another person, and that person does the same with us, and both people stay. So this is what Jesus was expressing is about how most people don't stay. In John, when he asks his disciples, I think it's in John, it might be Matthew, will you go away also? Because when he started to teach about the bread and the blood, the bread and the wine being his body and his spirit, people started, or his body and his blood rather, many of his disciples turned back and they didn't follow him anymore. And so he said to his apostles, will you go away also? And they said, where are we going to go? You have the words of eternal life. And so that's a rare thing. And then they all ended up forsaking him anyway. So this is a big deal. Now, Jesus didn't say everything that was on his mind. He also limited what he said. He even said, I have many things to teach you, but you're not ready for them. And that's when he said the Holy Ghost will come and he'll take over and he'll better match what you're willing to receive. That's another mystery, but I'll just go ahead and blurt it out. People incorrectly see the Pentecost as an outpouring of greater blessing from God. In a sense, they're right, but the question is compared to what? Not compared to when he was around. That was a downgrade. And it's very, very important to understand that. Because you can't understand what needs to be done before he comes back until you understand that. Anyway, it would have been an easier commandment for God to say that I am simply to be kicked out of the church, but that wasn't his saying to me yet. Yeah, it is his saying to a bunch of other people who aren't listening. But there are people who, and you can tell based on what you want. You know, if you want to stay and you think God's telling you to stay, you're probably wrong. If you want to go and you think God's telling you to go, you might be wrong too. Right? But if what God is telling you is the thing you don't want to do, there's a higher likelihood it's correct, because the natural man is an enemy to God. All right, as far as offensive teachings go, I've decided on some red lines in which I will absolutely have to stand my ground. That's good. If a teacher says that we can never be perfect, or that all we have to do is try, I consistently remind those around me with as much plainness as I can that absolute repentance is absolutely required and that nothing else will do. That's good. That's a good red line. I will also freely point out discrepancies between what the scriptures teach ought to happen and the church as a society and organization chooses to do. There are some points where when they teach or play a video from General Conference that I simply walk out to pray because I can't find any way to them past those teachings without insane amounts of context and reasoning. And therein is exactly what you should be measuring that by. Insane amounts of context and reasoning indicate a great distance between where they are and where you need them to be to connect. And so you stick to the things that they have the ability to understand and feel. Now, what I'm saying here, I'll just say explicitly. The tools we have to persuade other people are in them. If you want a deep dive on this, study D&C 50. True messengers don't try and don't want to persuade other people based on anything but their own conscience. They operate with that, not against it. The world and the devil will try to persuade people around that. But God gave it to us, and he uses our understanding to persuade us, because what he wants is for us to do the right thing because we want to do the right thing and because we understand it's right. One reason the devil doesn't do that is because it works against him. But that's sort of beyond the scope of this video. The more the devil encourages people to use their understanding, the less they'll agree with him. One simple proof of that is common sense tends to be right. But you could get a lot deeper with that. It talking about understanding and light and truth and knowledge and wisdom. And it all comes from and leads to God. And so the more you encourage people to use that, the more they will point more directly to God. And that continues and intensifies over time. Anyway, the weapons you have in this battle are inside the people that you're trying to help. It's not our job, and it's not even within our capacity to try to compel them or externally persuade them. So it's this weird battle where it's like levels deep inside them. And this is part of what it means, the phrase principalities and powers. But your body is interacting with their body, but it's really, you're trying to get God's Spirit through you, through them, into their spirit. And this is why sincerity is required to do this, to, quote, teach by the Spirit. So, excuse me. So your task is to intensify the power of their conscience and to share with them information that changes what they believe is most valuable. And that's very different than directly trying to shift something. What you're doing is you're giving them tools to continue to make their own decisions, or maybe to start making their own decisions, and to make them more accurately. Anyway. So as a result of that, people who start doing little things well begin to do big things well. Or when they start doing little things better, they start doing big things better. And that's why you always start with the smallest increment of improvement that you can imagine. And I'll tell you a vital, vital secret. This keeps you out of most of the trouble. You see, when I was figuring these things out, I didn't have anybody to show me this directly. No living example. But you don't have to make those same mistakes. And so what I'm like is an old grizzled warrior that I had half my leg cut off and I've got this gnarly scar and my face is all jacked up. But I'm trying to teach you how to sword fight and give you that experience, or the wisdom that I had to derive from what I would call dirty experience, right? Visceral, nasty, painful stuff. Figuring things out the hard way. But I'm saying, hey, here's my shoulders, hop up here, and you can see farther. You can start where I left off and hopefully go a lot farther. Or at least start a lot more ahead than I did. Maybe that's a better way of looking at it. So if you stick to the smallest increments, now he's at church, but this is especially important at work or with your family. If they're rejecting the smallest increment, it is more than unwise to keep pushing. I think I have a video that's called Don't Push Truth on the channel. It talks about this theme. But if you read in Alma 12, he lays out the rules of engagement. If you feed them the smallest increment of truth and they reject it, you don't get something way bigger and try to shove that down their throat instead. Now, most of us aren't dumb enough to do it if we think of it that way, but we don't think of it that way. We think, but I really care about this person. If I just do more, I can help them more. I know that there's something I can do to help them. No. If they reject something small, the only thing you can do, that you have two options. One, you try the same thing again later. Two, you try something smaller. That's it. And it says very clearly in Alma 12, when people turn away, what they can receive after that is reduced. When people turn towards God, it's the opposite. What they can receive after that increases. And so that's the good stuff. When you give them a small increment and they chomp it down and they squeeze all the value out of it that they can, and they really appreciate it for what it's worth, hit them up with a bigger thing. And maybe it's 2 steps forward. What was that old Paula Abdul song? 3 steps forward, 2 steps back? I don't know. Whatever the ratio is, maybe it's back and forth. That's fine. Just keep going. Keep going. But at some point, and this is part of learning the sincerity, you have to set it aside. not because you don't care about them, but because continuing to push is just going to hurt them more. And it will hurt you more. And you're not out to save your own skin, but you do have to use it for the greatest benefit. My friend Jared Eastley, he's a fan of the Costco rotisserie chicken. He made a joke once about this that I don't really remember, but somebody in one of his kids ate all the skin off one of these chickens that was in his fridge, and he was really looking forward to getting a slice of it. And he opened it up. He's like, "Where the heck is the skin?" You're not going to be able to save your skin, but you'd like it to go to Jared Eastley's kid, whichever one liked the skin so much they ate the whole thing himself. I'd say he gobbled it, but it's a chicken, not a turkey. So what manner of man is this that he can crack bad jokes like 2 hours into a video? Still fresh, guys. So, now the test is, can I get back to where I came from? So it's not about avoiding pain. It's about maximizing what comes from it. Just to be clear. Okay? So it's not that you don't keep pushing because you're afraid that person's going to hurt you. And the more you push, the more likely that is, by the way, for reasons I won't get into. But it's that someone else needs what you can give them more, and you can't do both. You can pick which hill you're going to die on, but you only get to die once. So it better be the highest hill. Okay, so let's keep going here. Where did I leave off? I think I was here. So I will also freely point out discrepancy. Oh, no, we did read that. When I have these moments, yeah, that's where we are. When I have these moments of an absolute spiritual uproar, I don't want to leave, but I don't know what else would be good. You know, you might just have to write that off as the cost of doing business. It's just the overhead of being there. And that's a vital part of atonement, is that you have to go to where the people are to reconnect them with God. You can't stay where you're connected with him, where he is. You have to come down. And this isn't just true with Jesus, and you can read about this in the book of John, for instance, but it's all over the place. But it's true with his servants, which if you're doing this, you're one of them. So if you look at Enoch, he lived with his family up in this mountain, all the righteous guys. And he left all those guys to go down to everybody else. And that was physical. But figuratively, you're going to have to go down. And it doesn't mean that you're going to adopt beliefs or behaviors that are less than the best you know. That's actually part of the demonstration of Christ, is that you have to continue to do that even in lower places. Like, people always like to trot out how Jesus ate with sinners. That's not exactly the same as hanging out with them. It says very clearly that he invited all of them to repent, and he didn't stay with the ones who didn't. He said, "Come follow me. I've got something better. You want to come along?" And the people said, "No, I'm good." He just left. Right? Okay, I fear that my reluctance to share what will offend most, if not all of the people in the classroom, limits what God can do with me. Oh, hopefully we've addressed that. I don't want to limit God's work through me. I don't want to attribute to myself more grandeur than what little I am. And I don't want to do more harm than good. Just having those concerns probably make it likely that you're doing better than you think. So congrats for considering those things. When Nephi spoke to his brothers about their wickedness, and when he tried to open their eyes to what God had called them to do, he famously did so cuttingly. And I'll interrupt here. Why? Because he tried a softer way and it didn't work. So this is good. This is a property of the smaller stuff. So sometimes, as the invitation gets smaller, it also gets sharper. So that's something to ponder. From what occurred, it seemed that his target audience, Laman, Lemuel, and the sons of Ishmael, did not improve. It may stand to reason that the benefit of Nephi's words were to us, his brother's posterity, and to his own family who did listen to him. Yeah, and I'd add it's the only thing he had left to try with Laman and Lemuel. For me personally, I know that I would have issues doing what Nephi did because I do not have the understanding that justified his actions. Fair enough. That's also a great consideration to make, so good job. The more obvious example in my mind is Jesus, who called out the lawyers, scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees, although very few of them ever changed. Perhaps the few that did change, changed so dramatically as to justify the cost of Christ's sayings. What Christ said may have also been justified by the effect it had on the outsiders looking in to see that there was a path to God that was higher than the authorities at the time. Perhaps those words were justified by the need to fulfill the prophecies given about him and how he would be murdered by his own people. So before I continue, excuse me, he mentioned something here that might not be crystal clear to those following along, so I'm just going to underline it. When you're doing this in public, there's a purpose beyond the effects it has on those you're speaking to. You can take this really deep, but because it literally impacts the world. But let's not go that far. Any onlookers, it's going to impact them as well. So a lot of times when Jesus was arguing with people, he knew that those people were not going to change at all. In fact, I should say that he knew that those people weren't going to agree with him any more at the end of the conversation than they did in the beginning. In fact, he knew they would turn away further as a result of the conversation. So why have it? Because if he let what they said and did sit, it would have caused greater harm to those who didn't have the ability to see through the false arguments, the lies, the tricks that those people were playing. He had to shut them down to protect other people who weren't capable of overcoming that, if that makes sense. So there are two ways to interact with someone when you're trying to share light and truth. The first is to persuade them. The second is to make them look and feel bad. And it might be a shocker to hear that. But if you look at the scriptures, there are situations where the second avenue is what Jesus would do. And I just told you the reason. And it's not just limited, I'll go further with this. It's not just limited to the effect on the people around them. Also, and coming back to being cutting with Laman and Lemuel, when people don't respond to reason, there's only one tool left, and that's feelings. The only way to reach unreasonable people is to make them feel bad. I've heard people say guilt is not a gospel tactic or something like that. They're absolutely 100% wrong. Where does guilt come from? It comes from your conscience. What is going to happen to someone who has seared their conscience into feeling comfortable with doing things they know are wrong when your presence boosts the light inside of them? When those fires get rekindled, guess what's going to happen? They're going to burn. Why do you think the natural response to someone who's invited to improve is to get angry at the person who's inviting them? Again, remember how I said the tools are inside the person? That seared conscience revives enough to cause guilt. And they think this person in front of me caused this guilt. No. Your conscience caused the guilt because you know that you are wrong. You know that you can be better than you are. You know that this is a choice. This doesn't come from the person standing in front of you or the person whose blog you're reading. If internally you felt justified with what you were doing, you would not be angry. Offense does not indicate who did the offending. In both cases, those who appear to be the messenger's target do not change in a significant way that appears to justify the cost incurred by the offense. I think I already covered this in what I just said, so maybe I'll skip down here. I'm scanning. I think I covered this already. Okay. Now we'll try to plug back in. Okay, I'll pick up here. From my experience with the Spirit, its effect on the mind is like any muscle that grows stronger with exercise. This is a deep, deep thought. Yes. I'll just say yes for now. However, although I believe sincerity can be more fully realized, like repentance, it is simply a choice to be sincere or not. Yeah, that's a binary one. And I think what he's saying, which is true, is that as your understanding changes, what you have to do to remain sincere will change, obviously, in different situations and everything else. But sincerity is either there or it's not. And actually, it's quite a high bar. It's quite a high bar to meet, which is why almost no one teaches with the power of the Spirit. That's why when Jesus came around, they just marveled and they said, "Who is this guy?" Because he doesn't teach like the scribes do. It's different. There's power in what he teaches. Continuing here, when I am in those rooms and conversations and I am completely bombarded by loud calls to improve these understandings, I can't tell if that is the Spirit commanding me to declare something or to simply recognize something. I think I've answered that. So just to be totally clear on this, your interaction with the Spirit is different than your interaction with the people. You are the interface. You are the API is what we'd say in programming world. You know, there's a server and they interact with the server, but they're not involved in the guts of the server. There are defined entry points and interactions that are really limited compared to all the inner workings of the server. All right. At other times when the Spirit comes, it's easier because I can simply translate its call into action. Yep. Yeah. And so the greater benefit is in the harder things. In public settings, it is like intense calculus trying to find the action that reciprocates to what the Spirit is telling me. Yes, it is. And you get better at this with time. So one morning I got up and it was like 1 a.m. or something. And in fact, the email might have been to this person. I don't know. But someone had written me something and I saw the timestamp was pretty recent. And in about 2 minutes, I wrote up 2 pages of stuff. And I sent it. And this person said, "How can you just whip this stuff out like this?" And I replied and I said, "Practice." So it turns out that finding the action that reciprocates to what the Spirit is telling you, to use this guy's language, that is a skill that you can advance in. And you can learn to do it closer to real time in more and more and more situations. And that's important to do. Continuing, in this difficulty, the worst thing is the feeling and knowledge that I could teach so much more. To my knowledge, God has called me to stay and preach until I am ripped out. Perhaps the exercise of taking the Spirit's message and translating into actions and words that others will benefit from is simply a practice I need to get better at. Yep. But I was wondering if you have a key that I need to help other people. I think I've shared a few of those, hopefully. If you do have a knowledge of what I'm looking for and you believe it's best for me to know, please share. My goal in this email is to feel more confident I am doing what God needs of me. It is best for all people for me to simply practice, if it is best for me, if it is best for all people for me to simply practice more, do as the Spirit commands you. Thank you, my friend. And thank you, my friend. People don't realize, but all of this interaction, it's all designed to help everybody. And I wouldn't have had the context to say the things that I've said in this video if this gentleman hadn't spent obviously considerable time formulating his ideas here. And now I'm able to return the serve, hopefully with a bit more than came across the net in the first place. And this is how it all goes. So hopefully this is helpful, and hopefully something about what I've said here sticks and you find applicable to your life.